Are Russian authorities actively trying to stop their own pilots from gaining employment outside of Russia? This and an overview of how the ongoing Russian invasion into Ukraine is still affecting the aviation world about half a year into the war is coming up in this episode, so stay tuned. We all know that the devastation and personal losses that are being inflicted onto the people of Ukraine because of this conflict takes precedence over everything material, including loss of aircraft and aviation. But for these videos we are focusing on the aviation side of things, which coincidentally is very important for Ukraine itself. And you'll come to find that the aviation industry within Ukraine is doing its best to try to survive these horrendous circumstances. So if we start by looking at Ukraine Airlines, which is the country's flag carrier, they had to immediately ground their fleet at the beginning of the war, but most of their fleet was actually not in Ukraine as the war started, and that was not a coincidence. If you remember, there were rumors about a potential Russian invasion as far back as in December 2021, and the airline had been listening to those rumors, and because of that they were reluctant to let any of their aircraft overnight in Ukraine out of fear of the aircraft being stuck there. And because of that, when the invasion actually started, only 10 out of the total 25 aircraft that Ukraine Airlines had actually got stuck in Ukraine. The rest was based outside and could potentially continue flying. Now, the full operation of Ukraine Airlines obviously could not continue since the majority of their routes was feeding into Ukraine, but this meant that they could wet lease out at least one of their aircraft to Air Baltic during the invasion. Now, one aircraft might not sound like much, but when you wet lease an aircraft out, you're not only leasing out the aircraft, you're also leasing out the crew and the maintenance personnel and everything that's required in order for that aircraft to continue to fly. And that is really important when you find yourself in a situation like this, because that gives you a crucial possibility to keep your crew current and flying and awaiting potentially better times coming up. In this case, Ukraine Airlines sent over as many as 28 people to Riga in Latvia in order to sustain the operation of this one 737. But recently they've also started charter operation with one of their 737-900s, and at the moment it looks like Ukraine Airlines is flying about 3 737 as well as one Embraer 190. Beyond passenger airlines, we also have companies like Antonov Airlines, for example, which continue to fly cargo aircraft from bases outside of Ukraine. So what about the Russian airlines then, and the Russian aviation industry? Well, they are facing their own challenges, to say the least, but the good news for them is that they still seem to be operating. A couple of months ago we saw how Aeroflot and other Russian airlines lost access to their booking system and their global distribution systems because of the ongoing sanctions against Russia. And as we're speaking right now, we don't really know whether or not they managed to replace those with their own system, or how they're doing it, because these systems are absolutely crucial for the effective organization and running of any airlines these days. What we do know though is that these Russian airlines are basically restricted to flying only domestically inside of Russia at the moment, and internationally to the countries who still haven't imposed any sanctions on Russia. But even to those countries, they're starting to creep in some issues on how these airlines are using their fleets. Because China, for example, have effectively banned Russian re-registered aircraft to utilizing their airspace. Remember how in a previous episode I explained how the Russian aviation authorities have started to re-register foreign-owned leased aircraft that previously was registered in Bermuda and Ireland into Russia. But in June, the Chinese aviation authorities sent out a message saying that they needed all of the international carriers that was going to utilize their airspace to provide ownership details about the aircraft that were entering the airspace. This was a highly unusual request, and all of the international airlines did comply with it, except the Russian ones. What this basically means is that all of those Boeings and Airbuses flying for Russian airlines that had been effectively stolen from the leasing companies could now not enter into Chinese airspace. We don't know why China went down this route, but the suggestion is that they were not only worried about the ownership details, but also the maintenance status of these aircraft. And this brings us into something that we've also touched on in a previous episode, which is the maintenance and use of spare parts on these Boeings and Airbuses. Earlier this summer, we were advised that the Russian aviation authorities had indeed issued authorizations to 5 domestic companies to do what they called minor changes inside of these Airbuses and Boeings. And also that they were going to issue the relevant documentation for these minor changes. According to the report, these minor changes mainly had to do with the interior of aircraft cabins, like the seats, chairs, galley equipment and so on, but the insinuation was that it might expand further later on. As I mentioned in my previous episode, the second they start doing this is going to have a profound effect on the future value and usability of these aircraft, because the service history is no longer traceable back to authorized dealers, authorized spare parts. And what it will mean is probably that these aircraft are going to stay inside of Russia forever. The next development is also a confirmation of a prediction that I did in one of my previous videos, and that is that the MC-21 or the MS-21 Russian aircraft is only going to be launched with Russian-made engines, and that is because Pratt & Whitney will not be providing the geared turbofan engine that this aircraft was originally supposed to be flying with, and that was actually the engine that it had been certified with back in December, and that certification basically means nothing now, so it needs to be recertified again. But I also predicted that just swapping out the engines to Russian engines was not going to be enough to properly Russify the MC-21 or indeed the Sukhoi Superjet or any of the aircrafts that are currently in development inside of Russia. There are tons of other things that needs to be done, including avionics and fly-by-wire technology and things like that. And because of this, the Russian authorities in late June announced that they were going to provide a stunning $14.5 billion in order to support future aviation or aircraft production. Now, that is a truly mind-boggling amount of money, and I'm going to tell you the reason why this is going to become so expensive for Russia after this short message from my sponsor. If you're watching this, there's a good chance that you, just like me, love a great documentary. That's why I have teamed up together with CuriosityStream as the sponsor of this episode, because they are a fantastic, really affordable, high-quality streaming service with some of the greatest documentaries and non-fictional titles in the world. CuriosityStream works on creating new titles every week, and they focus on things like science, nature, sport, history, and much more like that. My new favorite on the platform is The Mystery of the Roman Skulls, which is a really intriguing archaeological mystery from London, and you should definitely check that out, especially if you're a history buff. CuriosityStream is really affordable and it's available on every single platform that you can think about. So what are you waiting for? Use the link in the description here below. That will give you a whopping 25% off the normal price of CuriosityStream, which brings it down to only $14.99 per year. That's $1.25 per month, which is incredible value for money. So go down, check it out, and now back to the video. Now, $14.5 billion is an insane amount of money, and just to put it into perspective, when Bombardier started their projection of the C-Series, which later became the Airbus A220, they were projecting for a cost of about $2.1 billion. Now, that ended up costing almost $7 billion because of ballooning costs, but this amount is still more than twice as much, and Russia is not planning on producing any new aircraft. This is just to sustain the development of the projects that are already in the pipeline. The reason this is going to become so insanely expensive is because when the other aircraft manufacturers out there, Boeing, Airbus, Bombardier, when they start a project like this, they rely on decades of experience in building these type of systems. And they already have some systems that are working. They don't need to reinvent them from scratch. But this is essentially what Russia is going to have to do now. They're going to have to reinvent the wheel all over again from scratch on all of these systems. Hence $14.5 billion. And I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes even more expensive than that. The next really interesting story about Russian aviation came in the middle of June. Because what has happened now, obviously during the pandemic, but also after the Russian invasion started, is that Russian pilots have not been able to work as much as they did before. And quite a few of these pilots have started to go abroad, outside of Russia, to try to find employment. And these pilots, they weren't going to Europe or to the United States. Instead, they were going mostly towards Turkey, Cambodia, Thailand, and so on. But of course, when these Russian pilots went out to these new airlines outside of Russia, these airlines wanted the Russian aviation authorities to send them proof of their experience. According to news sites, about 600 of these requests had been sent in to the Russian aviation authorities, but only about 100 of them had actually been processed. Now, the reason cited for not processing these requests was impossibility to disclose personal details. But it is more likely that the real reason for not sending out these requests is for the Russian aviation authorities to try to stop a mass exodus of their pilots leaving the country. At the time when this news broke, there was about 70 of these requests being sent in every month. Now, to be fair, the problems that the pilots have faced with getting these kind of requests fulfilled didn't start in the beginning of the war. It started earlier than that. But prior to the Russian invasion of Crimea in 2014, there had been no problems with sending out this type of personal data. If we now go back to Ukraine, since my last episode about the Antonov 225, President Zelensky has gone out and publicly said that he intends to complete the remaining Antonov 225. In June, the billionaire Richard Branson visited Ukraine and posed for some photos next to the burned down skeleton of the old Antonov 225. And we know that previously Chinese investors were interested in buying the Antonov 225 in order to use it as a launch vehicle for rockets and put them into orbit. And there is a possibility that Richard Branson, who is the founder of Virgin Orbit, might also consider the Antonov 225 for this, because he at the moment is using a Boeing 747 for the same purpose. Now, Branson did not mention anything about this, and while he offered his general support for the Ukrainian people at his visit, he didn't speak specifically about the Antonov 225. He did, however, offer his support in the project of rebuilding Gostomel Airport, which is a crucial infrastructure part for especially Antonov Airlines. Meanwhile, the conflict continues to have an effect on the rest of the world's aviation industry. The leasing companies that own the aircraft that were nationalized by Russia in the beginning of the conflict are reporting some financial impairments because of it, but they don't seem to be threatened, as in their existence is not threatened financially by these nationalizations. And Boeing recently reduced their 20-year outlook for the aviation industry because of the loss of the Russian aviation industry. But even though Russia is a huge country in size, its aviation industry is not that big. So when Boeing did this recalculation, it only brought it back to the 20-year outlook from 2019 approximately. Finally, on a slightly lighter note, let's spare a thought for the Japanese airline Zipair. Zipair is a low-cost startup subsidiary to Japan Airlines, and they were supposed to start their passenger transport back in the summer of 2020. Now, for obvious reasons, that didn't happen. Instead, they started with some cargo operation, and then they completed their first passenger flight in the very end of 2020. Now, Zipair is operating Boeing 787s, and they have a very understated livery. But part of that livery is a big Z that's written on the tail fin on all of their aircraft. That was not a problem at all up until Russia invaded Ukraine and decided to use the letter Z as the symbol of their invasion. Now, repainting the livery of the entire fleet is a substantial cost for any airline, even if it's just the tail fin part of it that needs to be redone. But Zipair decided to do so anyway and replaced the Z with a color pattern instead. Fortunately, they were only operating 4 aircraft at the time, but they now also have to redo their uniforms, literature, websites, and quite a few other resources as well. So what do I think about this then? Well, I think that we've only really started to see the first kind of consequences of this invasion. And I think that the continuation, isolation of Russia as a country is probably going to have some really big consequences going forward. Not only in the next couple of months or years, but even in the coming decades. What I can say on a positive note though is that it looks like the aviation world as a whole is not being too badly impacted of the conflict so far. Obviously, we're going to have to wait and see what's going to happen to the oil prices going forward. That's going to be a big one. But also the general just uncertainty that's happening in the world. Whenever the world goes into a recession, whenever there are economic downturns, the aviation industry is generally on the forefront. It bears the brunt of that. It takes the consequences the very first of every other industry. But we're going to have to wait and see what happens. Now, if you want to know more about this topic, then check out this video up here, which I think you're going to find interesting, or check out this one. If you want to support the work that I do here on the channel, then consider becoming part of my Patreon family. It's a great bunch of people. We have Zoom hangouts every single week, and you can also support me by buying some t-shirt or some other merch. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.